All right, class, this is part two of the Vigil's Stage 3, Mexican Independence and Nationalism. I decided to break up these two lectures just to shorten up the films here, or the YouTube videos. Um, so this graphic here reintroduces the various classifications under the Spanish casta, the caste system. Eventually, the mestizo category of people became the more prominent group. And as Vigil goes on to argue, this system of formulating a social pecking order is supplanted with one based on color. This painting is an excellent illustration of this transition. As you see, the dark-skinned people laboring, even the children of a lighter color than the adults, would suggest that mixing is going on. And while the foreman on the horseback is even yet a lighter hue, with the fair-skinned owner, presumably the owner, resting peacefully on a hammock in the top center, carefree with his dogs at his feet. So this is a Diego Rivera painting, and I thought it was a good depiction there of the transition from the cast to one that's based on pigmentation of skin color. So the first challenges at the heel sites is this upswing in interracial marriages that was more common after the Mexican independence. Nonetheless, the question of race became more important with the spread of mestizaje. Mestizaje, again, remember, is that whole phenomena of mestizos. Actually, mestizos went from 27% in 1824 to 53% in 1900. Um, Easily becoming the majority of Mexican citizens there. Racial variations, white, mestizo to Indian, facilitated in-country migration. In other words, the criollos and the mestizos who passed for white were first to challenge the racial and racism and to promote tolerance and egalitarianism. As Vigil goes into in his book, in the chapter that we've read, um, this crossover group is very concerned about egalitarianism. Um, Even though there's much work done in this regard, um, they folks or society still views Indians as less than, as barbarians, as culturally and racially backward. Here is pretty much a hierarchy, a pyramid of sorts, of how it used to be under the caste system. Whereas Spanish colonial rule, um, the system dictated that one's position in society, um, post independence from Spain, Mexico shifted to a new hierarchy, and that was based on racial appearance. The white Europeans on top, the medium-hued, medium-colored mestizos in the middle there, and at the bottom of the pyramid was the dark Indians and Afro mestizos. Latin American elite flourished during this period. Um, Most of the working class was a dark-skinned population, but their plight worsened. Barriers with respect to social mobility emphasized facial features and skin color. Many leaders at the time wanted to encourage immigration from Europe to whiten the population by proposing to restrict migrations for Asians and Negroes, the term they used at the time. The situation for Indians in the North was no better, with some attributing their nature to that of animals, specifically that of monkeys. Racial theories at the time contributed to racial attitudes holding that persons of mixed race inherited not the best characteristics of each race, but the worst. Mexican Indians and mestizos became ingrained with this mentality of inferiority. Which brings us to the third C of Vigil's model, contact. And in this case, the contact is not with a European country like Spain, the previous era, but the United States and its quest to expand its boundaries from coast to coast. From the shock of the loss of Mexican territories, Mexico experienced an underlying philosophy driving westward expansion, one of the idea that Anglos, whites, held superiority over Mexican as people and as a race. The dominant mentality among policymakers and politicians, not to mention citizens, was that the social, economic, and cultural privileges should not belong to a culturally and racially inferior people. After all, Mexicans were nothing more than a mongrel race that incorporated not only the genes of redskins, but also blacks and other inferior people, quote unquote. Vigil goes on to argue that since manifest destiny embraced an attitude that looked disfavorably upon dark skinned people, generally held by Southern based Americans, the transition from an agricultural society to a modern industrial society or system supports his theory of the peasant to immigrant transformation for Mexicans. Here's a map of the territories of the United States and Mexico before the war, and this right here is a depiction of manifest destiny. If you notice, she's in this interpretation, she's sent from God. She's guiding the settlers going westward. If you notice, the Indians there fleeing from her very presence. She's lording over the trains that are heading westward. The settlers in the lower right. Um, and way in the background there, you can see the river, the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, I believe, and there's that westward expansion that's going on. Now, when the U.S. and Mexico went to war, it lasted 2 years, and the war ended with a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. And there's a couple of articles. Articles are like pieces of the contract, paragraphs, if you will, that I think are worth outlining here because they inform the experience of Mexican Americans, Chicanos later in the Southwest. The first one is Article 8. And this granted Mexicans the freedom to continue where they now reside or to remove at any time to the Mexican Republic, retaining property which they possess without their being subjected to any contribution, tax, or charge. This article required Mexicans to choose within 1 year whether they were going to stay or they were going to go. For those that remained, they automatically became U.S. citizens. And with that status of citizenship, property of every kind was to be respected, and the present owners, their heirs, and all Mexicans who acquire property shall enjoy, with respect to it, guarantees equally ample as if the same belonged to the citizens of the United States. In other words, these new citizens, these Mexicans that stayed and retained the citizenship were not to be second-class citizens. They were to be the full class citizens of the United States. There was about 2,000 folks or people that elected to leave, but most remained on their land. And the estimates are between 80 and 100,000 people, Mexicans, stayed in the United States. The next article is Article 9, and this guarantees that these U.S. citizens shall enjoy all the rights afforded to under the principles of the Constitution. And this means protecting their liberty, their property, their religion. And this is more important here with respect to Chicanos later. Besides the rights and duties of American citizenship, they, the Mexicans, would have special privileges derived from their previous customs of language, law, and religion. This article, Article 12, set the price at $15 million. And this is what the treaty involved. If you notice, the Mexican territories before the U.S.-Mexico War, and then after, those states in white are what we see. And I know lots of times folks don't realize there was 10 current states, United States, that were part of Mexico. As you could read here, Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Utah were all entirely of Mexican territories. and then with parts or portions in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. Vigil goes on to talk about the skirmishes and the resistance that take place in this new frontier. There's an upsurge of violence. Um, you have ranchers employing private armies to combat opposition and enforce their rule of law. And, and Mexicans literally and figuratively were under attack. And later we'll get into this whole social banditry and or outlaws, depending how you want to look at it, and how that makes a difference. So after the war, without moving, you had about 80 to 100,000 people slowly becoming strangers in their own land. In long term, the guarantees of the treaty did little to protect the rights of Mexicans. Politicians and law enforcement continually ignored the provisions. The change of property was not easy and an amicable transition. There was conflicts. Conflicts between the new and former residents of the Southwest occurred shortly after the war. From Texas to California, periodic revolts, wars, border raids, armed and unarmed confrontations, community upheavals, long-term skirmishes, and coordinated rebellions emerged in response to a variety of forces unleashed after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Having two distinct cultures come together resulted in a clash of cultures, with the source of clashes varying from state to state. In Texas, you had much of the conflicts focused on land and cattle, especially as you had a newly created border. The Plan de San Diego um, was a plan that was revealed in 1915 for a resurrection of sorts of a new state for Chicanos. Texas Rangers, they would be called Los Rinches, um, combine elements of vigilantism and state-approved violence. Um, it was their job was, unfortunately, to hunt Mexicans at that time. That was their primary role. Excuse me. In New Mexico, you had many conflicts over land. You had the arrival of Anglo cattle companies coming in, and with these new traditions, they cut off long-standing water rights and individual land holdings. Anglo settlers started coming in on this new railroad, the Santa Fe Railroad, and with that, there was transactions of land. Land was sold to the new settlers. But the problem is that in accordance with Mexican law and tradition, you could not sell your land. The land belonged to the people. You did have folks that had lived in New Mexico, the Mexicans there, the New Mexicans, if you will, Las Gorras Blancas. They resisted the Anglo land grabbers, and they were very active in that area, cutting fences, demolishing railroad tracks, and what have you. Arizona was a little different. A lot of their conflicts came from the mining and ethnic and class boundary violence. Um, you had some movement there between social classes. The Apache raiders, they fought with both Mexican and Anglo ranchers. So you had to have a larger military presence there in Arizona. Um, and then finally, the railroad, when it arrived in Arizona in the 1880s, it changed Arizona forever. Because, again, with the influx, you had a lot of folks going into California via Arizona for the gold rush. And speaking of California, lots of battles there or here in California over land. The first ones were mining conflicts with the influx of Easterners during the gold rush, 1848. And what happened is the Mexicans, with the generations and generations of mining experience, they're very successful miners. Um, their success proved to be too good. They were much too prosperous. And what happened was they drew the animosity and the wrath of other miners. Soon it was the Spanish speaking against the English speaking miners. Discrimination grew rampant, and many thought that those foreigners, quote unquote, had no right to be there. They were taking all the gold. And so what ends up happening is you had the legislature starting to change the laws and initiate laws. And one example in California Assembly asked Congress to bar all foreigners and Californios, quote unquote Mexicans, from the mines. When that wasn't successful, There was a foreign miners tax that targeted the same group of miners and assessed them a tax of $20 per month. Now, in our $20 doesn't sound a lot, but in those days, $20 was a lot of money, and that was paid monthly. These kinds of legislative acts were all um, used to exert unrestrained violence on the miners. You had a lot of claim jumping, extortion that was widespread. The miners' tax, even though it was repealed, it wasn't until after many Mexicans left mining and the area. Once the mining craze died down, these same people, these miners, turned to farming, um, which involved later they had to battle squatters. And because the Mexicans had gotten the more desirable land, they had to fight and battle land thefts and what have you. Even though that Article 8 and 10 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that these land rights would be honored. 1851, you had the Land Act, and what that did is it required all grant holders of land grants appear before the Board of Land Commissioners to prove their titles, despite the Treaty of Guadalupe. They were supposed to respect all those treaties. Now, later, the California Supreme Court ruled that this act was unconstitutional, but the damage had already been done. Three-fourths of the claims proved to be invalid, or excuse me, proved to be valid. In other words, yes, they owned the land, but in order to defend themselves in court, lots of times they had to hold up, they had to sell their holdings to pay for lawyer fees, court costs, and other expenses. Um, Recall back then you had to travel north if your land property was here in the south, and that would entail you being gone from your ranch for months on end. Eventually, this land loss played a factor, and the Mexican Americans' loss of political power.